So today it's time for our fourth grade lesson. What are the three great lessons that we've had so far? Can you tell me one of them?
God with no hands.
The coming up life.
Coming of human beings.
Yes. So we've had those three great lessons, and we'll figure out a day next week or the week after for the story of Numbers. But right now it's time for our fourth grade lesson, which is the story of communication in signs. And a few weeks ago, I think it was the second day of school. Was it the third day of school? I think it was the second day of school that we had our creation story. We had our story about how the universe was created, and especially how our earth was created. And we saw that at the end of that story, that the air, the water, everything had settled down. The earth, everything had settled down, and there was balance everywhere. But then, that balance got upset, and then life came on the earth to kind of clean things up. And we saw that there were experiments with all kinds of different creatures, from the smallest to the largest, and that again by the end of that story, that everything was balanced out. And also at the very end of that story, even though it took such a long time, at the very end of the coming of life, we saw that the earth was ready for human beings. And we saw that if human beings had come at any earlier time in the creation of earth, that they wouldn't have been able to live. And then we had our third great lesson, which was all about us. It was all about human beings and what makes us so special. Then we had the story in the church's sanctuary when Ms. Tenold took almost all of you in there to show you the black strip, so you could get another idea of how long it took until finally human beings came. Well, we don't know exactly how long human beings had been on earth when this story begins. There's just really no way of knowing. And this story is one of those once upon a time stories, and it's also a true story. When men and women first lived on earth, they needed food just like we need to eat. But there weren't any supermarkets then. There was nothing like that. People had to go out and find their own food. Sometimes they had to capture it by capturing some kinds of animals, and sometimes they could gather different kinds of plants together. They explored and they found things that were good for them to eat. They had to look around and find safe foods. Certainly not all plants and animals were safe at all, and they had to figure out which ones were the safest and which ones were the best to eat. And when someone found something that was good, she might say, "Hey, look what I found," and let everybody in her family or her tribe or her group of people see where this good food was. Maybe she was talking about some kinds of berries, like the wild blackberries that grow up in the mountains here. But what if she was far away from her group? Or when she found those tasty berries, if she wasn't close enough to even shout, how would she let them know that there was this wonderful patch or field of berries or some other kind of fruit to eat? She would still want to let her friends know, her family or her tribe. This was a problem. But then to solve that problem, somebody, we don't know who, thought, what if I make a picture of a berry on this big rock here by the berry patch? And then others, when they come later on, might see that picture and know that somewhere right around here, somewhere close by, that they can find some good food to eat. And for a long, long, long time, people in those faraway places, in those faraway times, that's exactly what they did when they wanted to let other people know about something. Well, time went on, and picture messages also went on for such a long time. And then sometime, during that long time of picture messages, a group of people called the Egyptians, and a lot of you second years have been working on a report about the Egyptians. Well, at some point the Egyptians started making a different kind of picture, and they carved them in stone or painted them on stones. Now you can imagine how long that would take to carve pictures out of stones or to paint them on stones. But that's what they did, and they were able to let a lot more people know about a story or some event or where something was. But then the Egyptians discovered a quicker and an easier way to make their pictures for messages. They found a way of making a kind of paper from a plant that grew along the rivers in their country. And they figured out how to make that paper. And then they were able to design some brushes and some kind of inks, maybe from some berries or from some other kinds of plants. And they learned how to write those same pictures and other new pictures on that paper material that they had invented. And they did this for a long, long time. But then someone else had a clever idea. Instead of using a brush, how about making and designing some kind of special pen that would be even faster to write on the paper? And so they used those pens for a long time. But you know, there was a little problem with these pictures that the Egyptians would draw. People didn't always know for sure what the pictures meant. Well, the person who drew the picture knew, but others who might see it later on, maybe 10 years after it was drawn, maybe 30 or 50 or 200 years after it was drawn, they couldn't be sure exactly what those pictures meant. I mean, one picture could mean different things. Sometimes a picture meant an object, like a pen or a table or a wall. They might have drawn a picture of a table or a pen, but other times a picture stood for an idea. And that was harder to communicate. And sometimes they had a picture that represented just a sound. So the picture of a leg might have meant leg. It also might have meant running, or it might mean quick. And there was no way of knowing, just from those pictures, exactly what was meant. So you can see this could be confusion. It could be confusing, and it just wasn't always clear. So of course with this problem, later on, this problem got worked on and solved by another group of people. The Phoenicians were great traders, and they had boats, and they traded all around the Mediterranean. And if you remember how the continent of Africa, and you remember where Egypt is, and you remember how the north part of Egypt sits right along the Mediterranean. Well, the Egyptians were farmers, and they made other things, and they loved to buy and sell things. Well, the Phoenicians also were great traders, and they loved to take things that other people had made and trade them to people who wanted those objects. And then they would take objects that those people have made, and so they were great traders. The Egyptians, of course, they were farmers and they grew crops. But those Phoenicians were sailors and traders, and they would go to all sorts of different countries and peoples and groups. And they carried silver and gold and perfumes. They carried jewelry and cloth and ornaments and paper and all kinds of wonderful things that people wanted. But they also carried something quite special, something that no one else could get. And they made something which was a beautiful cloth, and it was covered with a unique and special dye called Tyrian purple. And it wasn't a purple like on that t-shirt there. The purple that this dye made was a deeper, more red purple. And it was very rare. And cloth that was dyed that color was quite desirable. And rich people and other people, ooh, they wanted that so much. Well, the Phoenicians carried all their goods in their ships, and they sailed from city to city and from port to port. And people very much looked forward to the Phoenicians coming around so that they could buy the wonderful things that the Phoenicians have and then trade other things to them. But that really isn't the reason why the Phoenicians are so important to us. The real reason that they're important to boys and girls and men and women is that they did something else that was even more special than their trading. See, they traded with the Egyptians, and they knew about the picture writing of the Egyptians. And they knew that some pictures could stand for a lot of different things. And being business people, they didn't have time for a lot of complicated pictures. They wanted and they needed to record what was being bought and sold. They were business people. So they did something special. They decided to keep only the sound pictures that the Egyptians made. And only to keep some of those sound pictures that they made. And the interesting thing is that just from those sound pictures, it was much easier for them to write what they wanted to say. So the Phoenicians discovered something that you all discovered long ago when you worked with the movable alphabet. And you learned how when you wanted to build the word cat, you just needed to go over and get a k, an a, and a t. From the time that you were very young, out of school, you learned that certain symbols or certain letters stood for sounds. And that's what the Phoenicians did. They made that discovery that we still use today. They made it thousands of years ago. Well, as time went on, other people started to make use of that same idea. The Greeks came along and they used those Phoenician marks and for their own writing. Time continued on and the Romans came. And the Romans also changed the shape of those letters a little more. And it was the Romans who were the first ones to call those letters that the Phoenicians made an alphabet. They were the first ones to say that and to use that. And the marks that we use today look very much like the marks that the Romans used thousands of years ago. The story of our letters started with the Phoenicians, who made the first real marks that stood for letter sounds. And this lets other people know what we want to say. Even if those people are far away, even if those people are hundreds or thousands of miles away, or they're hundreds of years away, it lets people know what we want to say. And we can discover things that they wanted to tell us. You all know that story that I've been reading during our read-aloud time, The Magician's Nephew by C.S. Lewis. It was because of the Phoenicians and their discoveries that I'm able to read that story to you, and that you are able to understand that story, that you're able to hear that story and know what it is that C.S. Lewis himself wanted us to know. It was because of that discovery, those early discoveries that the Phoenicians had trying to solve a problem. So I think we should all say, "Thank you, Phoenicians." Let's say it. Thank you, Phoenicians. And that is my story for today.